When thousands of American farmers peacefully descended on the nation's capital in early 1979, few Americans knew anything about their financial hardships. One research group reported that in recent years, the purchasing power of the average farmer's net earnings had fallen below its 1970 level. Congressman William Wampler of the House Agriculture Committee painted an even darker picture, estimating that the purchasing power of most farmers' income was roughly equivalent to what farmers earned during the Great Depression of the 1930s. These severe financial hardships drive tens of thousands of farmers from the soil every year, according to the Department of Agriculture, and more than 3 million acres of farmland yearly are abandoned to non-farm use. But this is only a small part of America's increasingly grim agriculture picture. Much worse is the fact that government pays approximately 1/3 of America's remaining farmers to keep millions of acres out of production. These and other related problems have led to growing domestic shortages and to greater dependence on imports of the most important commodity used by man: food. What is behind this serious situation? Why must consumers pay higher and higher prices for food while farmers earn less and less? Why has our nation, with all the fertile farmland available to us, become a large importer of many kinds of crops? And as food imports and federal controls grow, is America becoming dependent on others for food in the same way that we have already become dependent on others for oil? To answer these questions, we are going to take a careful look at some of the principles of a free society, and we are going to contrast these principles with government policies, which for 50 years have steadily reduced America's ability to feed herself. In so doing, we shall see why some experts forecast a dangerously growing potential for the ultimate shortage: famine, right here in America. America traditionally has been known as the land of plenty. What some find mystifying is that a simple economic fact explains America's prosperity. It is that men who are free to keep the fruits of their labor have all the motivation they really need to become productive. And since Americans have been blessed with the greatest measure of personal freedom ever known, their nation also has become the most prosperous. That prosperity is seen in all the wonderful conveniences we enjoy. Millions of now commonplace devices provide such ease and comfort in our daily lives that today's poor in many ways enjoy a better living standard than rulers of old. Caesar, for example, never had hot and cold running water for his bath. Henry VIII was never warmed by central heating, and Frederick II was never illuminated by an electric light. The founders of our country well understood the principle we are discussing. In drafting the Constitution, they recognized that every man has a God-given right to live and work as he chooses and to keep the fruits of his labor. The role of government, as the founding fathers saw it, was to protect men's rights and nothing more. To protect them especially from government itself. From first-hand experience, they knew that governmental taxation and regulation are the greatest menaces to prosperity. The failures of communism provide clear proof of their wisdom. Communist governments tax 100% of all income and exercise total control over all industry and agriculture. As a result, native industry in communist nations is so primitive and inefficient that the Soviet Union is overwhelmingly dependent on the West for technology and productivity. Or let's consider communist agriculture. The Ukraine, once the breadbasket of Europe, cannot even feed its own people under Soviet control. Year after year, communist rulers make limp excuses about bad weather and bad crops for their chronically disastrous food shortages. But the simple truth is that food shortages under communist collective farming are inescapable. Other effects of the communist system are equally telling. An item in the Los Angeles Times reports that in the Soviet Union, 50% of the working class is needed to produce its food. In Red China, the figure is 80%, and still underproduction plagues both countries. On the other hand, the farmers who make up less than 3% of the population of the United States are capable of feeding at least 1/4 of all of the world's peoples, probably much more. The reason for this stark contrast is simple. In America, whenever a need developed, someone turned his skill and ingenuity toward filling that need, simply because his labors would bring reward. If, for example, there was not enough wheat to satisfy demand, prices and profits rose, attracting more farmers to produce wheat. If there was too much wheat, low prices encouraged less profitable wheat farmers to produce something else that would yield better returns for their labor. This elementary process prevailed in all of America's industry. As a result, here in the United States, there has always been plenty of everything. Until recently. Americans long have spent less of their income on food than any other people. But as grocery shoppers know, bringing home the bacon has become a lot more costly. Between 1967 and 1977, food prices almost doubled. By early 1979, they had again jumped by 30%. Meat prices and production give a good illustration of the painful problem. In 1978, Agriculture Secretary Bob Bergland asked Congress for more of our tax dollars to subsidize larger reduction of feed grain crops. His stated purpose was to create an artificial shortage that would bolster lagging prices for farmers. So what happened? Faced with shortages and sharp price increases for feed grain, cattlemen were forced to cut back their herds, causing beef shortages that sent beef prices climbing 4 times faster than the overall consumer price index in the first quarter of 1979. The government action created the beef shortages, but American cattlemen caught the blame. But while American cattlemen were being forced by government not to produce, beef imports from Mexico and elsewhere were rising sharply. Mexican beef can be raised at far less costs than our own cattlemen face. And no wonder. Mexican cattle is not checked for disease. And unlike American beef, which cannot be processed without the use of very expensive facilities and a USDA inspector on the scene, Mexican beef is slaughtered in substandard packing houses that have dirt floors, no refrigeration, no stainless steel equipment, and no USDA inspector. America's cattlemen do not want to lower their standards for cleanliness. All they ask is that imported beef, which is helping to drive them out of business, be subject to the same strict requirements imposed on them. America's beef consumers ought to ask at least as much. Thus, we see part of the vicious circle that brought thousands of financially troubled farmers to Washington looking for help. Some were wheat farmers who receive only about 3 cents from the retail price of a loaf of bread in 1979, according to a report in the Boston Globe. Out of that 3 cents, of course, a wheat farmer gets to keep very little because of all of his production costs. And those costs have grown dramatically. A tractor sold for $11,000 in 1971. 8 years later, the price had shot up to $45,000. The price of land doubled in the same period, and interest rates on loans also went up. Costly regulations from OSHA, the EPA, and the FDA contributed to a 15% overall increase of production costs in 1978 alone. And inflation by itself was expected to add between $4,000 and $9,000 to the farmer's expense the next year. Inflation, of course, is the little understood process whereby government increases the amount of currency to pay for its deficits. Inflation causes currency to lose value. Consequently, everyone raises prices in order to recover equal value. Everyone, that is, except the farmer. The farmer is told by others what his produce is worth. He is then paid for it with dollars whose value has been watered down by inflation. But those from whom he buys constantly raise their prices to account for government-caused inflation. America's farmers are the hardest-hit victims of inflation, and the government press and various other experts say that farmers help to cause the problem. What rubbish! But why is all this happening? Why are farm profits shrinking? And why can't farmers simply charge more to get better prices? More importantly, if the competitive free market system is as simple, as efficient, and as profitable as we have described it, why is it no longer working for agriculture? The answer is that someone has tampered with the system, and that someone is the federal government. Thomas Jefferson once said, "Were we directed from Washington when to sow and when to reap, we should soon want bread." We shall see that our shortened domestic food supplies and their rapidly rising costs are clearly the result of government controls that have made farming a financially impossible livelihood for most food producers. We begin by looking at federal policies, which for 50 years have been deliberately aimed at cutting production. The fact is that many billions of tax dollars have been spent getting our farmers not to produce food. In some years, according to the Department of Agriculture, over 60 million acres of farmland have been idled under various federal programs. To illustrate, the New York Times carried a report noting that in 1973, the same year that shortages sent food prices soaring, Washington paid American farmers $2 billion to keep land out of production. In 1978, 850,000 farmers were still setting aside some 15 million acres of crop and grazing land to qualify for government subsidies. Frankly, our government's farm policy makes no sense if food production is the goal. Yet, unfortunately, what we have described is really happening. While over 3 million more acres of farmland are lost every year, and while domestic food shortages threaten an already shaky economy, our government nonetheless continues to promote scarcity. Ignoring the principle that freedom to produce is the key to prosperity, our leaders today exercise regulatory powers over the market which intentionally bring about shortages and higher living costs. Ostensibly, the purpose of federal farm policies over half a century has been to help the farmer and the economy. But exactly the opposite has been the result. In 1929, at the beginning of the Great Depression, the Farm Stabilization Act became law, authorizing the federal government to buy and store millions of bushels of wheat. The action created a shortage that for a time did artificially bolster income for wheat farmers. But it did so at a cost of millions to the American people, already caught in the terrible Depression. 2 years later, the wheat was dumped back on the market, driving farm prices down to their lowest level in history. Thanks to federal help, many farmers were bankrupt by 1932. The farm stabilization experiment proved that government interference in the economy is disastrous. Had our lawmakers learned from experience and quit meddling then and there with agriculture, the free market would have soon corrected the problems. But instead, Washington tried to cure the problems created by regulation with more regulation. Franklin Roosevelt campaigned for the presidency in 1932, promising to stop government meddling in agriculture. His New Deal administration, however, pressed into law the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. It, too, allowed Washington to manipulate the market by government grain storage in facilities such as this one at Colo, Iowa. But the AAA went much further. In his superb book, The Business End of Government, political analyst and former FBI official Dan Smoot describes the workings of the Agricultural Adjustment Act as follows, quote, "Farmers were paid to destroy crops and animals instead of selling them at low prices to a public that was paying high prices for foreign imports of the same kind of foodstuffs." Unquote. Here we had the beginning of federal policies that continue until today. President James Madison once warned against what he called the old trick of turning every contingency into a resource for accumulating force in government. How right he was. The contingency used to enact the AAA was a so-called national emergency in relation to agriculture, but the so-called emergency caused by surplus crops was non-existent. In recent years, one of the leading experts on American agriculture was the late author and syndicated columnist Dan P. Van Gorder. His extensive research on the farm situation even received high recognition from a special congressional committee. In his book, Ill Fares the Land, Mr. Van Gorder demonstrated that the agricultural controls of the 1930s never were necessary because there never was any surplus. Pointing out that the U.S. imported 110 million tons of farm commodities between 1925 and 1933, he said over 66 million tons of this total, or 60%, could have been and should have been produced on American farms by American farmers. Included in those U.S. imports were over 4 million tons of dairy products computed as whole milk. Interestingly enough, in 1934, a government publication entitled Consumer Guide reported that the nation then needed 15 million more cows just to reach adequate milk production. Yet AAA Administrator Chester Davis called for eliminating between 6 and 7 million milk cows and heifers, quote, to bring the cattle situation back into balance, unquote. The effect of government meddling in pork production was even more dramatic. By 1933, the per capita number of hogs in the United States had declined to half of what it had been 60 years earlier. Yet that same year, Agriculture Secretary Henry A. Wallace decreed the slaughter of over 6 million young pigs. In a truly incredible statement during a radio broadcast, Secretary Wallace tried to defend his tax-funded slaughter by saying, quote, "It is common belief that pork is high today because the little pigs were killed in 1933. As a matter of fact, there is more pork now and the price is lower because these pigs were killed 2 years ago," unquote. A Midwestern editor appropriately labeled that statement as hogwash. The fact is that the Secretary's logic made no more sense than did the government's destruction of millions of dollars worth of other foodstuffs. Least of all did it make sense during the worst depression in our history, when 1/4 of our labor force was out of work and when many Americans had to stand in bread lines to get food for their families. Something else fails to make sense. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was proposed in 1933 to alleviate the alleged food surplus. In his 1933 annual report, Secretary Wallace had said, "We have at least 40 million too many acres in crops." 32 years later, in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson said that the nation had 50 million too many acres in crops. President Johnson asked us to believe that excess cropland had actually increased, in spite of enormous population growth and tens of billions of dollars spent in the meantime to get farmers to harvest less acreage. The Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service issued this document in 1976. It tells why 5 decades of government's costly expert management has failed to arrest the reported menace of overproduction. Here is how the USDA explains, in characteristically clear and simple language, why farm production is too high. In case you missed the USDA's point, you are looking at a bureaucratic explanation of why government land reserve programs have failed. If this explanation is still unclear, here is some additional information designed to help. Now, some may think this bureaucratic nonsense is all very funny, but remember that the joke is ultimately on all of us. The USDA document gives another reason why paying farmers not to grow hasn't ended the non-existent surplus problem. It says, another yield-related factor is that yields may increase because farmers apply inputs more intensely to the remaining land they are allowed to use for production. Which is the government's quaint way of saying that because they work hard on what land the government allows them to plant, farmers are cheating. The real cheating here, however, is that our own government is cheating American farmers out of their birthright and American taxpayers out of tens of billions of dollars, all to eliminate agricultural surpluses that never existed. This colossal swindle has gone on for 50 years in the name of helping the farmer and the economy. Yet the farmer and the economy have hardly been in worse shape. Former Massachusetts Governor Joseph B. Ely once observed, "Overproduction has been held out to the American people as one of our greatest enemies. It has led to all manner of fantastic panaceas. It underlies the modern delusion that the less we produce and the more we spend, the more we will have." But the looming question that remains is this government policy only delusion? George N. Peake was the first man to head the Agricultural Adjustment Administration in 1933. After 1 year, he quit his post in frustration and wrote the book, Why Quit Our Own? In it, Mr. Peake told why he believed that our problems were due to more than delusion. He said of his New Deal bosses who designed our agricultural policies, "They deeply admired everything Russian. To them, Russia was the promised land, and the sooner the United States became like Russia, the better for everyone." Peake reported that the legal division of the U.S. Department of Agriculture formed the plans which eventually turned the AAA into a device to introduce the collectivist system of agriculture into this country. And he concluded, most of that crowd, in their effects, were communists. The fact is that they were communists in more than just their effects. In a speech delivered before the Senate in 1950, Senator Styles Bridges of New Hampshire documented that the men responsible for America's new attitude toward agriculture were identified communists. He reported, quote, "This effort went forward under the direction of the late Hal Ware. A part of Ware's program was the organization within the Department of Agriculture of a communist cell, to which Lee Pressman, Nathan Witt, John Apt, Alger Hiss, Charles Kramer, and Victor Perlow belonged," unquote. This was the infamous Ware Cell, a communist apparatus described as the master cell in Washington. Several of its members advanced into extremely sensitive government positions. Harold Ware himself was a charter member of the Communist Party and a top agent of the Comintern. As Senator Bridges demonstrated, Ware took orders directly from Lenin. He had spent 10 years in Soviet Russia helping to set up collective farming and actually to implement Stalin's deliberate murder of millions of Russian farmers by starvation. As AAA Administrator George Peake said, Harold Ware and his fellow subversives in the New Deal were using the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to impose the same communist-style collective farming here in the United States. But why did these high-ranking communists make agriculture their first target? Peake explained they are talking social revolution, and they have the idea that it is the mission of the Roosevelt administration to turn us into some kind of socialistic state. They think the place to start is with the farmers, because it is the farmers who, in other countries, have formed the chief obstacle to socialism. History shows that the way to eliminate the opposition of farmers as the chief obstacle to socialism is to make them dependent on government subsidies for their existence. For the farmer who must first provide for his family will not so quickly stand up to his provider. In 1936, the Supreme Court declared that the communist-conceived Agricultural Adjustment Act was unconstitutional. The Roosevelt administration then pushed for enactment of a new farm control measure. The new law provided for even more intrusion into agriculture than the unconstitutional 1933 measure. But by now, as political analyst Dan Smoot observed, quote, President Roosevelt had seated a New Deal majority on the Supreme Court, and the court approved the AAA of 1938. All subsequent federal farm laws have been amendments of or additions to the 1938 Act, unquote. What this really means is that all federal farm policies and programs since the 1930s have had as their foundation a law which was declared unconstitutional in 1936, a law conceived by communists for the purpose of turning American agriculture into a repressive system of government-controlled collective farming. Basic farm policies under every administration, from Roosevelt's through Carter's, have followed the original pattern. Abundance has been consistently painted as an economic menace. Year after year, the public has been told of the dangers of overproduction, and that too many farmers were planting too many crops and raising too much livestock. The result has been a steady drive for more and more federal regulation over agriculture, regulation that has made the farmer a virtual ward of the state. Let's look at some examples. Both Presidents Truman and Kennedy proposed programs that had all the economic essentials of collective farming. Truman's plan sought to nationalize agriculture, in effect by making farmers draw their wages directly from the federal government. President Kennedy proposed a plan whereby the government would determine both wages and production for the farmer. The Kennedy plan was basically the same system that had been used by Mussolini in fascist Italy. Fortunately, Congress rejected both of these proposals. But farmers were not so fortunate under the Eisenhower administration. In just 1 year, 14,000 of them were fined a total of nearly $9 million for illegal harvesting. These terrible farmers were not cultivating marijuana or opium poppies. No, they were found guilty of growing wheat, deadly golden wheat, which Washington apparently considered somehow to be dangerous to society. What happened was this. Beginning in 1954, wheat farmers were arbitrarily told how many acres they could legally plant. The compulsory program came complete with wheat police, federal agents who, without warrants, could trespass on private property and conduct surprise inspections for contraband wheat. We again quote Dan Smoot from The Business End of Government. Says Mr. Smoot, "The wheat police assumed a judicial role to assess penalties against the farmer. If the farmer did not pay, the wheat police would seize his bank account, his personal property, or his farm, or all of them. If he resisted, he would be jailed without trial." Two of the victims of this reign of terror were Lauren and Mervyn Kajewski of North Dakota, who in 1960 were fined $5,000 for allegedly overplanting wheat. As American Opinion magazine detailed, the Kajewskis tried to fight the matter and were brought to trial on charges of criminal conspiracy, quote, to impede and defeat the AAA, unquote. For planting wheat on their own land, they were sentenced to 2 years in a federal prison. Remember, we are not describing events that took place in Soviet Russia or Red China. We are talking about the United States of America. As noted, Congress had rejected President Kennedy's supply management proposal, which was similar to Mussolini's fascist system. But Congress did approve the Food and Agriculture Acts of 1965 and 1977, and these laws have gone far beyond the Kennedy proposal towards establishing government-controlled collective farming in the U.S. A look at the 1977 law will demonstrate this. The Food and Agriculture Act of 1977, as amended in 1978, puts into operation a complex system of regulatory controls that includes target pricing, deficiency payments, commodity loans, land idling, acreage controls, price supports, diversion payments, and massive grain storage programs. With these programs and a $20 billion budget, the Department of Agriculture has been handed the greatest measure of power it has ever held for regulating farm production and income. And the farmer really has no choice in the matter. Even if he tries to operate independently of government regulations, he must compete with farmers who are federally subsidized. The subsidized farmers can buy land, equipment, and stock with government loans. True, they must also produce their goods in regulated quantities and sell them at regulated prices. But such farmers then qualify for federal price supports. Since an independent farmer cannot realistically compete against that kind of system, he is forced to join it just to survive, and in so doing, he has been forced to give up his freedom to produce as he sees fit. There are no assurances, however, that a farmer will survive even with federal subsidies. Figures released by the Department of Agriculture show that many American farmers now draw the largest part of their incomes from non-farm employment. Close to half of them, according to the statistics you see, earn more than 90% of their wages away from the farm. Doesn't this fact alone indicate that government control is strangling agriculture? J.S. Selden III is a young Virginia farmer who has to supplement his income doing a variety of extra odd jobs. Mr. Selden is well acquainted with the financial hardships of farming. He estimates that a young man needs at least 600 producing acres to start a farm and still be able to support his family without outside income. Mr. Selden explains, quote, "At today's prices for farms and equipment, you're talking about an investment of close to $700,000. Besides interest on property loans, you have to pay taxes. That alone is about $70,000 a year off the top. And I don't believe many farmers will be able to generate that much money while maintaining the farm and equipment and paying the labor," unquote. Mr. Selden tells of a friend, a successful cattleman, who in 1978 netted less than half a cent profit out of every dollar that he took in. Selden says that this man puts in 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, to say nothing of his financial investment. He wonders whether anyone but a farmer would try to survive on profits of less than 0.5%. No wonder farmers who went to Washington early in 1979 got angry when Agriculture Secretary Bob Bergland actually accused them of being driven by old-fashioned greed. What is wrong here? For starters, says J. Selden, a month doesn't go by without 3 to 5 government people coming on the cattleman's farm to examine his books or to inspect his operations. Each of these federal agents costs the farmer, costs him both his income and his freedom. It is by increasing controls such as this that government is taking over our farms and our farmers. It was in a celebrated 1942 case against a farmer named Filburn that the Supreme Court ruled it is hardly less than due process for the government to regulate that which it subsidizes. To the federal government, of course, this means that government must regulate what it subsidizes, and the government certainly can't be accused of shirking its presumed duty where farmers are concerned. America's farmers are worried, and with good reason, because control from every level of government is choking the life and liberty out of agriculture. Leading the frontal assault are the regulatory bodies, whose unelected officials assume total legislative, administrative, and judicial powers. The American Farm Bureau Federation says, "We are increasingly concerned about the growing power of regulatory agencies in government that in effect are enacting more laws than the legislative branch." Livestock men are also concerned. Richard A. McDougall, president of the National Cattlemen's Association, warns if current government regulatory trends go unchecked, 20 years of technological progress in agriculture will be nullified. The industry will return to much more inefficient and more costly methods of livestock production. Former Agriculture Secretary Clifford Hardin, describing what he called the lengthening tentacles of the federal regulatory octopus, said he is more concerned, quote, because of the knowledge I gained on how regulatory groups are able to grow almost unchecked, unquote. That unchecked power and growth is due to the fact that regulatory agencies are unelected bodies that answer to no one. One of the farmers' biggest problems is the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA, for example, prohibits the use of DDT and other effective pesticides. As a result, American farmers are now feeding more insects and fewer humans. Meanwhile, Mexican farmers who can and do use DDT ship tons of produce into the United States every year. No one wants to eat contaminated vegetables, of course, but no one has ever been able to show that DDT constitutes a hazard when used as a pesticide, a fact openly admitted by former head of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus. In spite of that admission and many scientific studies to back it up, DDT is still banned, and farmers continue to suffer greater crop losses. The EPA's crusade for pollution-free water spells still more trouble for agriculture, which is the nation's largest user of water. Agricultural economist Dr. Gary Carruthers explains that by 1983, agribusiness's use of water could be strictly regulated by Section 208 of the Water Pollution Control Act. Dr. Carruthers adds that by decree of the courts, the EPA's water pollution controls must be enforced over every square inch of the United States. Consequently, even animal waste in pastures constitutes a form of potential water pollution which the EPA says must be completely controlled at all costs. And it will cost farmers plenty. That is, unless the agency has guidelines for toilet training livestock. But the most sinister water use scheme comes from the Interior Department, which has dredged up a senseless and long-since abandoned law called the Reclamation Act of 1902. That law limits the size of farms using federal water to only 160 acres. According to the Wall Street Journal, quote, irrigated farms larger than the 160-acre limit would be broken up by the government and sold to deserving applicants, unquote. Interior calls this plan land reform. Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro used a similar plan and called it agrarian reform. There are, of course, many other government agencies in the picture with many more plans. The choking effects on agriculture and related industry are multiplied many times over by the combined direct regulations of the USDA, FDA, ICC, OSHA, the Department of Commerce, the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and literally countless other departments, commissions, agencies, boards, and bureaus at every level of government, but most especially at the federal level. Our founding fathers made no provision for most of these federal bodies, and none at all for the regulatory force that they exercise. They amount to illegal and dangerous usurpations of power by an ever-growing government that threatens the freedom of all Americans. An example of the sum total of these regulatory intrusions was given by a research group at Colorado State University. Its study found that some 41,000 government regulations control just the production of a hamburger. Another example appeared in the Record Stockman. The newspaper said that one Midwestern milk plant licensed by 250 local governments, 3 states, and 20 other agencies reported that it was inspected 47 times in 1 month. Such massive government control is not only dangerous, it is costly for everyone. When the government pays farmers not to grow, for instance, it is really the public who is paying. First with increased taxes, then with higher inflation caused by Washington's deficit spending, and then again in higher retail prices resulting from government's created shortages. The cost of each regulatory measure imposed on agriculture must also be passed on to the consumer. In the same way, every tax agricultural commerce incurs throughout its entire distributive process likewise is ultimately paid by consumers. But the farmer is unable to pass on all of his extra costs, and the American public has been led to believe that it is the farmer who should be blamed for higher food prices. The largest profiteer, however, is no one else but government. In his book, Tax Target Washington, author Gary Allen shows that the retail price of a quart of milk contained 87 hidden taxes. By the same token, there are 100 taxes on a carton of eggs and 151 taxes on a loaf of bread. Mr. Allen explains that when you buy bread, you are paying a part of the combined taxes of the farmer, the miller, the trucker, the baker, and the supermarket. Obviously, these people all have to recover the taxes they must pay, and they do so in the prices they charge for their goods and services. On the matter of government's hidden costs, Congressman George Hansen of Idaho states, "Most people blame the difference between farmer receipts and food prices on middleman profit, without realizing that the big middleman is the government." Let's very quickly review the situation we have been describing. For about 50 years, federal farm policies have been based on President Roosevelt's Agricultural Adjustment Act, a law which was once declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but which was later reenacted with even more destructive capability. That law was inspired and implemented by top Department of Agriculture officials who were high-ranking members of the Communist Party. And their purpose, according to the AAA head, George Peake, and other knowledgeable authorities, was to establish Soviet-style collective control over American agriculture. As we have seen, every administration since 1933 has consistently followed the collectivist pattern by expanding regulatory control over agriculture. The regulation has become so vast that American agriculture, for all intents and purposes, is now being run by the state, and the American farmer, says Congressman Charles Grassley of Iowa, is visibly becoming a serf controlled by the federal government. The consequences, of course, have been disastrous, not only for the farmer, but for the public as well. We have also seen that a so-called national emergency of food surpluses was the excuse of establishing federal regulation of agriculture, and that the surplus pretext has been kept alive for 50 years as the means of expanding federal control. One effect of Washington's menacing controls has been increasing domestic shortages. As a result, the United States has become a leading agricultural importer. The fact that our nation is increasingly dependent on food imports has been well hidden. We all know how serious our nation's dependence on foreign oil is. Imagine then what would happen if there were ever a food embargo similar to the Arab oil embargo. Just how dependent are we on agricultural imports? The USDA's most current agricultural statistics show that between 1963 and 1977, those imports had increased by 50%. Meat imports were especially high. The USDA says that by 1977 we were importing about 2 billion pounds of beef annually. The figure is incomplete, however. Hundreds of millions more pounds of beef enter the country every year as live cattle, but the USDA deceptively lists these supplies as part of domestic beef production rather than as beef imports. And since 1977, of course, American cattlemen have had to reduce production, increasing our dependence on beef imports even more. Former Congressman John Rarick dramatically illustrated our agricultural deficit in 1972. He showed that it would have required millions more American farmers, hundreds of millions more livestock, and hundreds of millions more acres of farmland to produce the commodities we were importing at the time for premium prices. The point, of course, is that American farmers could produce those same commodities better and cheaper than any foreign producer. And if our agricultural economy were free of destructive government controls, there would be many more American farmers to produce those goods profitably. But instead, thousands are forced to quit their farms every year in financial despair. Apart from federal agricultural controls, there is another major cause of our domestic shortages and rising food prices. It is Washington's policy of handing over massive amounts of our food to foreign nations. A close look at this scheme clearly reveals that the real purpose of our policymakers is to bolster the faltering systems of socialist and communist regimes. At the same time, our own government is systematically robbing and leveling the agricultural prosperity of our nation. In 1954, President Eisenhower initiated the so-called Food for Peace program. Through this program, the federal government subsidized food shipments worth some $20 billion to foreign powers. Among the largest recipients were communist governments. The disastrous effects of Food for Peace handouts reached a high point after what has been called the Great Grain Robbery of 1972. That year, as part of a package which effectively canceled the $11 billion Lend-Lease debt owed us by the Soviet Union, President Nixon begged Kremlin leaders to let the U.S. ship them over 700 million bushels of American grain. The grain was sold to the Soviets at artificially low prices and subsidized with federal funds to the tune of $1.35 per bushel, which means that our farmers got paid with their own tax dollars. The communists were then allowed to buy the grain on credit, and our government guaranteed payment, all of which means that the communists really didn't have to pay anything. And judging from past experience, they probably did not pay anything. Direct cost to taxpayers for this one handout was almost $2 billion. The Russian grain deal wiped out our reserves and created food shortages in the United States that sent prices to record highs. This pushed the overall bill for the grain robbery up several $billion more, so that the estimated total cost to each American family was $500. Then, in 1975, the Ford administration signed a 5-year agreement to sell the Soviet Union between 6 and 8 million metric tons of grain each year on generous credit terms. In 1979, the Carter administration raised the limit even higher, allowing Moscow to order as much as 25 million metric tons of our nation's grain, almost half again the amount of the 1972 grain steal. Also in 1979, the Red Chinese, who now likewise enjoy federally guaranteed credit, placed what was for them a record order of grain worth $700 million. These huge grain deals with the communist giants prompted the New York Times to warn with headline emphasis that a shortage of wheat looms. Farmers are constantly being told that grain deals with communist nations are beneficial. But these deals involve subsidized prices, long-term credit, and Uncle Sam picking up the tab. The result is more taxation, more inflation, higher prices here at home, and more government control over agriculture, all of which is helping to drive American farmers out of business. The only real beneficiaries, then, are the communists. Authors Anthony Sutton and Patrick Wood explain in this book, Trilaterals Over Washington, that the original directives for the Soviet grain giveaway came from Henry Kissinger. Mr. Kissinger is a member of the Executive Committee of the Trilateral Commission, a fact which adds greater significance to the grain deal. For the Trilateral Commission is an elite international organization created by an advocate of Marxism, who dreamed of creating a new world order. It is also a powerfully influential force in American politics and governmental policy making, having many high government officials among its members and former members. In its published recommendations, the Trilateral Commission urges controls over the entire world's agricultural production and the creation of massive storage programs to achieve equitable distribution of food supplies among the world's nations. Such a scheme, stripped of its deceptive idealism, is nothing but the communist system of state control of food supplies. Only in this instance, the system would be imposed universally throughout the world. What is wrong with this scheme for world order is not merely that such a system can never possibly work. Much worse is the absolute power over everyone that it gives to governments. For what better way of controlling people is there than by controlling food supplies? This headline, reproduced from a 1935 Chicago newspaper, tells how the communists starved 6 million Ukrainian peasants. After murdering the farmers and seizing their crops, the Soviet government was then able to control the rest of the population because it controlled the food supply. Such barbarism is standard communist practice. Yet government control of the entire world's food supply is now being advocated by the Trilateral Commission, to which Henry Kissinger and other powerful political figures belong. Authors Sutton and Wood quite bluntly state, the Trilaterals intend to use food as the weapon to bring about the New World Order. In their view, the New World Order dream of these trilateralists is really a communist-style world order. It so happens that President Jimmy Carter is one of the original members of the Trilateral Commission, as are Vice President Walter Mondale and numerous other cabinet-level officials of the Carter administration. And it also happens that a major feature of the Food and Agriculture Act, implemented in 1977 by the Carter administration, is a massive grain storage program. Such a grain storage program is exactly what the Trilateral Commission has proposed. In our attempt to assess the problems in American agriculture and their causes, we are fortunate to have the expert views of two outstanding members of Congress. The man you now see on your screen and whose voice you are about to hear is the Republican representative from Idaho's 1st District, a member of the House Committee on Agriculture, the Honorable Steve Sims. Here is Congressman Sims.
As a member of the House Committee on Agriculture, I am well aware of the extremely critical situation that American agriculture is facing, a situation which seriously threatens the entire economy and welfare of our nation. I am particularly concerned about the implications of a 1977 report by the Trilateral Commission concerning world agriculture. I wrote an article for review in the News magazine in which I discussed some of the implications of the Trilateral Commission's objectives. We pointed to the Commission report entitled Collaboration with Communist Countries in Managing Global Problems. The report was enthusiastic about a worldwide grain reserve program because it would greatly benefit communist regimes such as the Soviet Union. Again, in February of 1978, the Commission published a proposal calling for a much broader international agreement to regulate world agriculture and food prices. These programs would indeed benefit the communist empire, which constantly suffers from disastrous failures of collective farming. But the American farmers and the American public would pay the cost. Worse still, such programs could be enforced only by additional and far-reaching government controls over the farmer. Federal controls and regulations as they now exist are already making the American farmer an endangered species, and I am convinced that further controls would be fatal.
And now you will hear from another respected member of Congress, a man who distinguished himself as a medical doctor prior to his election to Congress in 1974. Here is the Democratic representative from Georgia's 7th District, Dr. Lawrence P. McDonald.
I am pleased to add some remarks to what my colleague, Mr. Sims, has just said. For there is a lot to be said about our serious agricultural situation. But I will confine myself to just one thought. Few today remember that many of our nation's founding fathers, including Washington and Jefferson, were farmers. In fact, the famed shot heard around the world, which began our nation's war for independence, was fired by an embattled farmer. A major grievance leading to that historic struggle for independence was Britain's regulatory encroachment into the affairs of farmers. Colonial planters found their land so rigidly regulated that they could not even sell a portion of it or divide it among their children without the government's approval. Under increasing government harassment and restraint on free trade, our early farmers finally said, enough. Yet the regulations and restraints imposed by British rule amounted to very little when compared to the enormous agricultural controls being exercised by our federal government today. I hope that modern Americans are themselves ready to say enough to our leaders in Washington.
At this point, we come back to the question which began our presentation. What is in store for America? For what we have is indeed a farm problem, but even more, it is a food problem, which is everyone's problem. So what do expanding regulation and threatening international policies mean to our future? The answer is frightening, but there is no mistaking the direction in which our country is being taken by the New World Order schemes. Unless government's constantly growing regulatory control over agriculture is stopped, and unless American agriculture is once again made a free competitive enterprise, our nation is headed for government-created, government-controlled famine. The same kind of famine Stalin used to subjugate the Russian people and to murder millions of farmers who tried to resist communist tyranny. Make no mistake about it, it can happen here. And it almost certainly will happen here. unless something is done to stop it. Obviously, the solution lies in systematically cutting away the dense mask of regulatory strands of government control that have been fastened tightly over our entire agricultural process. That effort should begin immediately with eliminating the costly, destructive, and totally unnecessary regulatory agencies at every level of government, especially at the federal level. But ultimately, all government meddling in private agriculture should be eliminated. In fact, we do not even see any need for a federal Department of Agriculture. Whatever genuinely useful services that mammoth bureaucracy provides could be performed better by private organizations, more efficiently, at less cost, and at less danger to the public. It is equally obvious, however, that such efforts will never even begin until an aroused and determined public raises itself to meet that task. So what can you do to help stop the imminent threat and to restore America's free enterprise system? To begin with, you and many others must become better informed. Better understanding of the critical dangers of government control is absolutely essential. We suggest that you begin with Dan Smoot's superb book, The Business End of Government, an in-depth look at federal regulatory bodies and their destructive effects on our freedom. We also strongly recommend that you arrange to see the Filmstrip presentation, The Insiders, or at least read the published text of that presentation. The Insiders examines the Trilateral Commission and the powerful influence it exerts in American policymaking. And we suggest that you keep regularly informed by subscribing to the weekly Review of the News and to American Opinion magazine, both of which carry authoritative and enlightening articles on agriculture and other significant issues. The federal takeover of agriculture is only one part of a much larger assault on American freedom. As we have said, the direct threat facing all of us is the constant increase of power in Washington. Yet indirectly, the greatest danger actually comes from the American people themselves. All too many Americans prefer to ignore the specter of growing government power that is visible everywhere today. Too many pretend that the problem is not yet serious, or that it will somehow go away all by itself. Such attitudes are not only immoral, they are suicidal. The very real problem we have been discussing will not go away of its own accord. It will get much worse unless enough Americans face up to their personal responsibilities and commit time, effort, and resources to make it go away. Such a commitment can no longer be put off, for time is running out. So let us also suggest that the best way to channel your efforts in the very real struggle to save our freedom is to join the John Birch Society, and then help us get others to see this important presentation on the agricultural situation. Organization is essential if success is going to be achieved, and the most effective organization for the job at hand is the John Birch Society. America does not have to become another controlled nation, where freedom to produce has been scuttled, and where shortages and even famine stalk the land. Will you do your part to keep America free? We hope you will, and we welcome your willing hand.